is a superhero. His name is Saul Luciano Luya. And you might think that he doesn't really look like a superhero, and yet this man is already winning a fight against an opponent that's much larger and more powerful than himself. But before I tell you about this fight and how he's winning it, I first want to tell you a little bit more about Saul himself. He lives in Peru, in Huaraz, a town in the mountains, underneath a lake and 2 glaciers. He lives there in a house, small house with his family, and works as a farmer and as a mountain guide. Here in Geneva, in the Alps, you probably understand what I mean when I say Saul really loves the mountains. He tries to spend as much time as he can outside, and he understands that without water from the lake, there would be no life in Huaraz. There would also be no irrigation for his field. And without the trails, there would be no work for him as a mountain guide. But his connection to the mountains goes much beyond that. He feels a deep spiritual connection to his mountains. Now, how did I get to meet this person? It is pretty unlikely. I'm from Germany. I work for an environmental NGO. We follow the climate negotiations. And like most of you, I spend most of my days at a desk behind a computer. So my life is completely different from Saul's at first sight. And yet, there is one thing Saul and me have in common, and that is that we are extremely worried about the global climate crisis. Many people, when they talk about climate change, talk about as something that is in the future, that is about future generations. But Saul reminds us that the climate crisis is real today. For him and his community, his family, his neighbors in Huaraz, it is something that is happening right now. It is an existential threat for them today. On his hikes in the mountains, Saul has been observing that the waters of Lake Palcacocha, the lake above the city of Huaraz, have been rising for years. The glaciers have been melting. Lake Palcacocha today is 40 times as large as it used to be in the 1950s. And these masses of water are pushing against the dam that is the only thing standing between the lake and the city of Huaraz. At any time, large chunks of ice could break from the glaciers, fall into the lake, and lead to a flood wave that would be 50 meters high and could collapse the dam. If the dam breaks, the entire content of the lake would be released, the equivalent of 4,500 swimming pools in less than 1 hour. This would be a devastating flood that would destroy large parts of Huaraz, including Saul's house. So what did he do when he realized this imminent threat literally hanging above his city? I said, he's a superhero. So you might think maybe he built a new, stronger dam with his own hands. Or he made the glaciers freeze again with a look from his eyes. But he did none of that, because he is a superhero without supernatural abilities. There are 3 things that make Saul a superhero. He's smart enough to ask the right questions. He's courageous enough to confront powerful opponents and stand up against injustice. And he's persistent enough to stay in this fight for as long as it takes. So he did ask the right questions. Why is this happening? Why are the glaciers melting? And that's how Saul learned about climate change. Because the glaciers are melting because of global warming. Global warming that is happening because humans are burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And actually, not everyone on the planet is contributing to this problem to the same extent. Just 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of all carbon dioxide and methane emissions since the beginning of industrialization. Just 90 companies. So while people in Huaraz and other vulnerable communities are threatened by the impacts of climate change today, they have actually contributed very little carbon pollution. The problem is caused elsewhere in the world, mainly in the rich countries. And that is why climate change poses a fundamental problem of global injustice. And when Saul realized these facts, he asked another question, the question that changed his life. Shouldn't those responsible for climate change, wherever they may be on the planet, also be the ones who pay for protection against potential damages? Saul decided to act. He didn't want to wait and to become a victim. He wanted to take his fate into his own hands. He was discussing climate change with a regional agricultural advisor who had heard of Germanwatch, my organization, at the climate summit in Lima, Peru, that was happening in 2014. And he established a contact with Saul. That's how a small group of colleagues from Germanwatch went up to Huaraz and met with Saul and his family for the first time. They discussed climate impacts on his community, and Saul asked them this question. So they put him in touch with a lawyer who's an expert on legal issues around climate change, Rhoda Verheyen from Hamburg. After many discussions with her, Saul took a very courageous decision. He was going to demand Europe's largest emitter of carbon dioxide to help finance flood protection for Huaraz. Europe's largest emitter is the German energy company RWE, a large company that operates large coal-fired power plants and has contributed to 0.5% of all emissions. So Saul is asking them to pay 0.5% of the cost of protecting his property. And that's actually how I came to meet Saul when he came to Europe to deposit his lawsuit. I was very impressed by this humble and quiet man, yet very determined man, who wasn't taken off track by all the media attention for his case. Let me maybe tell you one example. So, one newspaper had written mistakenly about Saul and his 3 children. He only has 2. And the media outlets were all interested in his case, copying from each other, so everyone was writing about Saul and 3 children. One day, standing on a metro platform in Paris where he was attending the climate summit, Saul got a call from a reporter, and one of the questions he asked was, "How many children do you have?" Saul's response, a classic, I think, he said, "Well, I have 2 children, but the newspapers are all writing I have 3. So when I come home, my wife will probably beat me." So Saul kept his sense of humor. He also kept his sense of purpose and kept fighting towards his objective, because it does take persistence to be a superhero. It took 2 years and over 700 pages of legal documents to get to the day in November 2017 that wrote legal history. It was amazing to watch. You had Saul and his lawyer on one side, and a whole team of lawyers, all men, in nice suits, well paid, very confident that they would win, representing RWE on the other side. But as the presiding judge began discussing the merits of this case, they all became smaller and smaller in their seats, these RWE lawyers. Some were getting really nervous. Some were starting to write hastily in their notebooks and didn't look up anymore. The main case lawyer had his hand glued to his mouth. He simply could not believe what was happening. because the judges of the higher regional court decided that Saul's case was well-founded. It doesn't matter that your emissions are happening on one side of the planet and the impact is elsewhere. It doesn't matter that you only are responsible for a share of the emissions that cause the problem. It doesn't matter that it's not illegal to operate coal plants. German law says if somebody interferes with your property, you have a right to demand the removal of the impairment. Complicated legal term, which simply could mean in this case protection against the imminent danger of a devastating flood. So basically, emitters of greenhouse gases must accept responsibility for the hazards associated with global warming worldwide. The judges are now asking for evidence to be presented. So they've decided that Saul's claim is justified in principle, but he has to prove the specifics of his case. So his fight continues. But legal history has already been written, because this is the first time a court is saying, in principle, a private company can be responsible proportionally for its share in climate damages. And this has immediate implications much beyond RWE. It creates a material financial risk for any fossil fuel company that has large emissions, because they could be sued successfully. Similar laws exist in over 50 countries. So these companies now have to make adequate provisions for the potential payments that they could face. And investors have to think twice before investing in coal, oil, or gas companies. This has the potential to really upset the entire business model of the fossil fuel industry. And this is what makes Saul a superhero. This day, when he had won this first fight in his battle for climate justice, Saul was very emotional. He said, "The lakes are the tears of the mountains, and today justice heard the mountains crying." And Saul is not the only superhero taking polluters to court. Just a few examples. In the United States, cities on the coast are suing the oil companies because of sea level rise. In the Philippines, the Human Rights Commission is investigating the responsibility of fossil fuel corporations. In the Netherlands, a group of citizens has successfully won its lawsuit against the government, which had to enact stronger climate policy. And the day after, where do all of these lawsuits lead? It is a problem of planetary proportions. Millions of people are already feeling the impacts of climate change today, particularly the most vulnerable in the poorest countries. The United Nations estimates that $300 billion will be needed per year to finance adaptation to climate change in developing countries by 2030. So if Saul wins, RWE has to pay 0.5% of his cost. But what about the other 99.5%? And what about the impacts of climate change elsewhere? Saul would have legal standing to go after other polluting companies and ask for their contribution. And millions of others could do the same thing. But can you actually imagine that? Millions of people suing hundreds of companies in dozens of countries? It would be an extremely burdensome and complicated system. So we will need a better solution. We need an international political answer to this problem. We need a system of global climate solidarity. And a superhero like Saul, he needs asking the right questions, he needs courage, he needs persistence. But to really win this fight for climate justice, he needs one more thing. He needs a movement. We need people marching in the streets for climate justice. We need people like my colleagues at German Watch who make proposals in the international negotiations on how to organize such a system of climate solidarity. We need people asking their governments, the companies they buy power from, the companies they invest in, what are you doing to address this problem? We will continue to need people like Saul who take the polluters to court, because this creates pressure on governments and corporations to act. It's a reminder that as long as there are no adequate political answers to this problem, those facing the impacts of climate change have no choice but to use the legal system to get their rights protected. And we will also need hundreds and thousands of people supporting Saul and the other plaintiffs. He's a smallholder farmer from Peru. He does not have the financial resources to travel to court, to pay the legal fees. And in the next phase, he has to present scientific evidence. That's going to be even harder to finance, and we haven't raised the necessary funds for it yet. But with hundreds of people and their contributions, it was possible to get this far, and it will be possible to win. This movement, all of these people, are superheroes. They're humble superheroes like Saul, no Superman, but ordinary people willing to stand up against injustice. And you can be one of them.